The galaxy had always been a place of calculated indifference, especially when it came to species like the Zekthar. A fragile and technologically underdeveloped race, they were small in stature and had no real defense systems to speak of. The Zekthar had always lived in peaceful isolation, never bothering anyone and never expecting much from the greater galactic community. They were healers and philosophers, not warriors. But the galaxy doesn't care about peace when predators lurk. On the horizon, the Vaki had begun their approach, a merciless species, driven by conquest and bloodlust. For them, the Zekthar were simply another weak race to devour. There was no diplomacy with the Vaki. Their ships, massive and brimming with firepower, darkened the sky above the Zekthar homeworld, and everyone knew what was coming. The Vaki didn't just conquer, they obliterated. Their goal wasn't to enslave but to erase. The Zekthar, in their desperation, reached out to the Galactic Council, pleading for help. The Council had the power, the resources, and the military might to intervene, to stop the impending massacre. But the Council wasn't built on compassion, it was built on politics and strategy. The Zekthar weren't strategically valuable. Their planet wasn't rich in resources. Their existence didn't shift the balance of power in any meaningful way. The message was clear, they were expendable. Leaders from other races chimed in, with their voices ringing through the council chambers, expressing polite condolences for the Zekthar's fate, but they would not involve themselves. Not against the Vaki. It was far too risky. Why put their own species in danger for a race that brought nothing to the table? They had other alliances to worry about, trade routes to protect, and their own people to think of. The Vaki, after all, were a terrifying force. It wasn't worth the cost. Meanwhile, the Zekthar stood helpless, watching their requests for aid disappear into silence. Each message returned with vague promises of monitoring the situation, or outright dismissals. The Vaki's approach was inevitable, and with each passing day, the Zekthar's chances of survival grew slimmer. Their leaders met in dim-lit chambers, their faces drawn with fear and exhaustion, knowing that no one was coming. But not all species were alike in their calculations. In the far reaches of the galaxy, beyond the borders of the Galactic Council's reach, humans had carved out a place for themselves. Humanity, still relatively new to the interstellar stage, was known for its unpredictability. They had a reputation for defying expectations and doing what other species wouldn't. While many alien races saw humans as erratic and overly sentimental, humanity had survived through sheer resilience, not because they were the strongest or the smartest, but because they didn't know how to give up. When the Zekthar's distress signal reached human space, it caught the attention of Captain Alex Harper, a seasoned officer with more than a few battles under his belt. He had seen the Vaki in action before, and he knew exactly what awaited the Zekthar if no one intervened. The Galactic Council had already sent orders for humanity to stay out of the conflict. The Zekthar weren't allies, after all, and the humans were still struggling to solidify their own standing in the galaxy. But Harper wasn't the kind to sit idle while innocents were slaughtered. Orders or not, he felt the weight of his own conscience pressing down on him. He had seen too much death, too much needless destruction, to ignore the call for help. It didn't matter if the Zekthar had nothing to offer in return. It didn't matter if it wasn't humanity's fight. Sometimes, the right thing to do was the hardest thing. With a few quick communications, Harper began rallying his fleet. It wasn't a large force, certainly not enough to stand toe-to-toe with the Vaki in open combat, but it was enough to make a difference. His officers, seasoned like him, didn't question the decision. They knew Harper too well. If he said they were going, they were going. Other human commanders weren't as quick to act. Some saw it as a suicide mission. What good could a small human fleet do against the Vaki's overwhelming forces? They had seen what happened to other races that tried to resist. Yet those under Harper's command didn't need convincing. They had fought alongside him before, and they trusted his instincts. Harper wasn't leading them into a suicide mission, he was leading them to do what was right. As the humans prepared to move out, whispers spread across the galaxy. The Galactic Council tried to discourage them. Warnings came in, citing political ramifications, the risk of drawing the Vaki's ire. But humanity had never played by the rules that other species adhered to. They didn't care about political maneuvering. They cared about doing what needed to be done, regardless of the consequences. Harper and his crew knew the risks, but they also knew they had something the Vaki lacked: ingenuity. The Vaki were used to crushing their opponents with sheer force. They didn't expect resistance, especially from a species that others considered impulsive and reckless. But that was humanity's strength. They thrived in situations where others faltered, adapting, finding new ways to survive, and most importantly, they stood up for those who couldn't stand for themselves. As the fleet moved toward the Zekthar homeworld, Harper knew the odds were stacked against them. The Vaki fleet outgunned and outnumbered them in every conceivable way. But that wasn't going to stop them. It never had before, and it wouldn't now. The Zekthar, abandoned by everyone else, would not be abandoned by humanity. The human fleet emerged from the darkness of space and approached the Zekthar homeworld. Below, the planet lay devastated, its once thriving cities now little more than rubble under the relentless bombardment of the Vaki scout ships. The Zekthar, huddled in underground shelters, had been bracing for the final wave of destruction, knowing that no one was coming to save them. But then, through the smoke and chaos, the human ships arrived, their sudden presence both shocking and unimaginable to the Zekthar. For the Zekthar, who had been all but forgotten by the galaxy, the sight of these unfamiliar vessels was almost incomprehensible. They had expected only death, yet now, a fleet stood between them and certain annihilation. Word spread quickly among the Zekthar survivors: the humans had come. The race they had never thought of as potential allies had defied every expectation. No one else had even considered helping them, but here the humans were, prepared to risk their lives for a people they didn't know. The first meeting between the human commanders and the Zekthar leaders took place under tense but hopeful circumstances. The Zekthar leaders, their faces worn with fear and exhaustion, could barely comprehend what was happening. They struggled to understand why a race they had little contact with would put themselves in such danger for a cause that seemed so futile. Their surprise was evident in every word, their voices trembling as they thanked Captain Harper and his crew for coming. They weren't just grateful, they were in disbelief that anyone would help them. Captain Harper, however, kept his tone matter-of-fact. There was no room for sentimentality or grand speeches. The Vaki were still out there, and the clock was ticking. He assured the Zekthar that humanity had come to fight, not because it was strategically advantageous or because they stood to gain anything, but because it was the right thing to do. The Zekthar, hearing this, felt something they hadn't in a long time: hope. For the first time since the Vaki had begun their assault, they weren't alone. The cultural differences between the two species were stark. The Zekthar had always been a peaceful race, valuing diplomacy, intellectual pursuits, and spiritual reflection. Their society had never focused on military prowess or conquest. In contrast, the humans, while capable of great empathy, had grown accustomed to conflict, adapting to it as part of their survival. Where the Zekthar valued careful deliberation, the humans acted with urgency, their decisions swift and decisive. Despite these differences, there was a strange harmony in the way they began to work together. The humans were quick to recognize the Zekthar's limitations but also saw their potential. Captain Harper and his officers immediately began sharing tactical knowledge, teaching the Zekthar how to make use of what little they had. It wasn't about turning them into soldiers overnight, that was impossible, but about showing them how to be resourceful, how to think creatively under pressure. The Zekthar, who had always relied on others for protection, were now being asked to take an active role in their own defense. Harper acknowledged that the Zekthar didn't have advanced weaponry, but that didn't mean they were helpless. The Zekthar's knowledge of their planet's terrain, their underground networks, and their ability to communicate over vast distances without relying on technology were all assets. Harper encouraged them to use what they knew best, to find ways to resist the Vaki that didn't require traditional warfare. It was about survival, not victory. Every advantage, no matter how small, could make a difference. As the days passed, the bond between the two species grew. Human soldiers, many of whom had never even heard of the Zekthar before this mission, found themselves forging deep connections with the alien civilians. The Zekthar, in turn, were fascinated by the humans. There were moments of lightheartedness in the midst of the grim situation. Zekthar children staring in awe at the human soldiers' weapons and armor, trying on helmets that were far too big for them, and laughing when they toppled over. In those small moments, the Zekthar began to see the humans as more than just soldiers. They were protectors, and more importantly, they were friends. The humans, for their part, didn't treat the Zekthar with pity. They respected their resilience, their quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. The Zekthar had every reason to give up, yet they continued to fight for their survival in whatever ways they could. It was this shared understanding of perseverance that brought the two species closer. Harper himself spent time among the Zekthar, listening to their stories, learning about their culture, and understanding what they had lost. He made sure they knew that humanity hadn't come to save them out of charity. They had come because it was a fight worth fighting. However, the Vaki weren't far behind. Their full fleet was approaching, a massive armada far larger and more dangerous than the scout ships that had already wreaked havoc on the Zekthar homeworld. The Vaki had learned that humanity had come to the aid of the Zekthar, and they weren't pleased. What had begun as a routine conquest was now becoming a more complicated affair. The Vaki were relentless, and they would not allow an upstart race like humanity to stand in their way. With each passing hour, the tension grew. The Zekthar, still reeling from the earlier attacks, were now facing the reality that the full force of the Vaki was about to descend on them. But this time, they weren't alone. The humans were with them, and the Zekthar had begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. Captain Harper gathered his troops, addressing them in a calm but firm voice. He reminded them why they were here, not for glory, not for conquest, but because they were the only ones willing to stand up for those who had no one else. He told them that the Vaki would show no mercy, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they didn't give up. No matter how overwhelming the enemy, no matter how desperate the situation, they would fight, and they would fight for as long as they could stand. As the Vaki fleet loomed on the horizon, the final preparations were made. Every soldier, both human and Zekthar, knew what was coming. The Vaki weren't just a threat, they were a storm of destruction that would leave nothing in their wake. But now, there was a sliver of hope, and that was enough. The Vaki fleet descended on the Zekthar homeworld with the force of a tidal wave. Their warships, sleek and bristling with weaponry, filled the skies, casting long shadows over the shattered cities below. From the outset, it was clear that the Vaki had brought their full might to bear. Their war machines were far superior to anything the Zekthar or even the humans had. They moved with precision, cold and unfeeling, as they began their invasion. The planet, already on the brink from the initial bombardments, shook with the impact of fresh assaults. The Vaki had come not just to conquer but to erase. On the ground, chaos reigned. The Zekthar, who had barely survived the Vaki's scouting ships, now faced the full force of their armada. Buildings crumbled under the relentless firepower. Smoke filled the air, and the ground shook with every impact. The Vaki troops, massive and heavily armored, began to pour into the cities, their advance seemingly unstoppable. Panic spread among the Zekthar civilians, their fear palpable as they realized the scale of the invasion. The Vaki were merciless, sweeping through with the singular goal of extermination. But humanity had prepared for this moment. Despite the technological disparity, Captain Harper had anticipated the Vaki's overwhelming approach. He knew they couldn't win in a head-to-head confrontation. The Vaki had the advantage in raw power, but humanity had something else: ingenuity. The human forces, small in comparison, were scattered strategically across the battlefield. Harper had devised a plan that played to their strengths, focusing on guerrilla tactics and ambushes rather than direct confrontation. The Vaki, accustomed to overwhelming their enemies with brute force, were caught off guard by the humans' unconventional strategies. Harper had deployed his troops in small, mobile units, using the terrain to their advantage. While the Vaki advanced in large, concentrated groups, the humans struck from hidden positions, hitting supply lines, command posts, and vulnerable flanks before melting back into the shadows. These quick, decisive strikes disrupted the Vaki's meticulously planned assault, creating confusion and forcing them to divert resources to deal with the unexpected resistance. One of humanity's greatest strengths had always been its ability to adapt. In the midst of battle, the humans used whatever they had at their disposal, turning the Zekthar's own environment into a weapon. They rigged entire sections of the city with explosives, using collapsing buildings to trap Vaki troops. They flooded tunnels, lured Vaki forces into ambushes, and employed hit-and-run tactics that kept the enemy off balance. The Vaki, used to overpowering their opponents quickly, found themselves in a drawn-out conflict, their forces slowly being chipped away by the relentless human strikes. Yet, even with their brilliant tactics, the humans could not be everywhere at once. The Vaki forces continued their inexorable advance, and the Zekthar had to face them directly. What had once been a species known for peace and diplomacy now found themselves in the middle of a war for survival. But the Zekthar had been watching. They had seen the humans fight, had witnessed their bravery in the face of overwhelming odds. And something within them began to change. The Zekthar, who had never considered themselves fighters, began to rise to the occasion. Inspired by the humans' relentless courage, they took up arms. They weren't skilled warriors, but they were fighting for their very existence. Each Zekthar that picked up a weapon did so not with confidence, but with the knowledge that they had no other choice. Slowly, they began to organize. Under the guidance of the human commanders, they learned to defend their home using tactics suited to their limited technology. They fortified their underground shelters, set traps, and began to fight back in small but significant ways. Among them, a civilian named Kareen, once a scholar and healer, emerged as an unlikely leader. Kareen had never held a weapon in his life, but as the Vaki continued their relentless assault, he found himself rallying others. His knowledge of the planet's tunnels and caves proved invaluable. He led teams of Zekthar through underground passages, striking at the Vaki from unexpected angles. His courage in the face of impossible odds inspired others to follow, and soon the Zekthar resistance was no longer just an idea, it was a reality. But the battle came at a cost. As the humans and Zekthar fought together, the losses began to mount. Human soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, sacrificed themselves to protect their alien allies. There were moments of heroism that would be remembered for generations, soldiers who held the line against impossible odds, buying precious time for civilians to escape. One by one, these brave men and women fell, their lives given in defense of a species they had only just met. Each loss weighed heavily on the remaining soldiers, but none of them faltered. They knew the stakes. The Vaki, enraged by the unexpected resistance, intensified their assault. The human forces, though brilliant in their strategy, were beginning to wear thin. Their numbers dwindled as the Vaki pushed closer to the Zekthar capital. It became clear that the Vaki had one goal left, to obliterate the heart of the Zekthar civilization. The Vaki's warships began targeting the capital directly, their cannons unleashing a barrage that shook the planet to its core. As the Vaki closed in, Captain Harper faced a grim reality. His forces were spread too thin, and the Vaki were gaining ground faster than they could hold it. The Zekthar capital was on the verge of falling, and if it did, there would be nothing left to save. Harper knew what had to be done. He gathered his remaining troops, preparing for a final stand. They would defend the capital with everything they had, even if it meant their lives. There was no retreat, no surrender. The Vaki would not take the Zekthar without a fight. The Zekthar, too, prepared for the final battle. Kareen, standing among his people, felt the weight of what was coming. But there was no fear in his eyes, only determination. They would stand with the humans, not as helpless civilians, but as allies. The Vaki might be stronger, but they would never break the spirit of the Zekthar and their human defenders. The Vaki fleet loomed over the capital, casting a shadow over the battlefield. The ground shook as their forces advanced, their victory seemingly inevitable. But Harper and his soldiers stood firm. This was their moment, their last stand. The odds were impossible, but that had never stopped humanity before. The Vaki had underestimated the humans once, and now they were about to learn what it meant to face a species that never gave up. As the battle raged on, Harper gave one final command to his troops. They would fight for every inch of ground, for every Zekthar life. No matter what happened, they would make sure the Voraki paid for every step they took. And so, with the enemy bearing down on them and the Zekthar standing side by side with their human allies, the final chapter of the battle for the Zekthar homeworld began. The battle was nearing its breaking point. With the Voraki closing in, it seemed as if the end was inevitable. The human forces were exhausted, and the Zekthar capital stood on the edge of total destruction. The Voraki, relentless and overconfident, pressed forward, certain of their impending victory. Yet Captain Harper had one final strategy left, a move that no one, not even the Voraki, could have predicted. Harper's plan was risky, almost reckless, but it was their only chance. While the Voraki focused their attention on the ground forces and the capital, they had left their fleet's rear flank vulnerable. It was an oversight born from arrogance. They had never encountered an enemy who could challenge them in such a way. Harper had noticed this weakness early on, but he had been waiting for the right moment. Now, with everything on the line, he gave the order. A small, specialized human strike force, equipped with experimental cloaking technology, had been lying in wait far from the main battle. Their mission was to disable key Voraki ships from within, striking at their power systems. The Voraki, so focused on the frontal assault, never saw it coming. One by one, critical ships in the Voraki armada began to lose power, their massive cannons going silent. Confusion spread through the Voraki ranks as their command structure faltered. It was the moment Harper had been waiting for. Seizing the opportunity, Harper ordered a full counterattack. Human ships, outnumbered but emboldened by the sudden turn of events, launched a coordinated assault on the now vulnerable Voraki fleet. The Zekthar, inspired by the sudden shift in momentum, joined the fight with renewed energy. Their underground resistance, led by Kareen, began launching surprise attacks against the Voraki ground troops. It was chaos for the Voraki, who had never expected such fierce resistance from a species they had deemed too weak to fight. The tide of battle turned swiftly. The Voraki, who had once seemed invincible, found themselves in disarray. Their ships, crippled by the human strike force, struggled to maintain formation. The human fleet, using tactics born of desperation and creativity, pressed the attack. Harper's gamble had paid off, and the Voraki were now on the defensive. The Voraki commanders, realizing the fight was slipping away from them, gave the order to retreat. What had started as a certain victory for the Voraki had now become a full-blown rout. As the Voraki ships began to pull back, their ground forces followed suit, scrambling to evacuate their positions before the humans and Zekthar could overrun them. The once mighty Voraki, who had come to destroy, were now fleeing for their lives. It was a moment of triumph, but it was not without its cost. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of those who had fought and fallen to defend the Zekthar homeworld. The victory, while hard-earned, came with a heavy toll. In the aftermath of the battle, the once destroyed cities of the Zekthar began to stir with life again. The humans, though weary from the fight, stayed to help the Zekthar rebuild. It wasn't just about repairing physical damage, there was a deeper restoration happening. For the first time in their history, the Zekthar had fought back, and they had survived. The Voraki's retreat had left a mark on the galaxy, showing everyone that even the most vulnerable species, with the right allies, could stand up to the strongest threats. The Zekthar, once passive and dependent on others, had learned to fight for themselves. But they knew they could not have done it without humanity. As they began to rebuild their homes and their lives, they expressed their profound gratitude to Captain Harper and his crew. The Zekthar leaders, still reeling from the enormity of what had just transpired, stood before Harper and his soldiers, offering words of thanks that felt too small in comparison to the sacrifices made. For the Zekthar, this victory was more than just survival. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in their history. No longer would they be seen as the weak, defenseless species that others could ignore. Their alliance with humanity had changed their fate, and their bond with the humans promised a brighter future. Harper, though never one for speeches, accepted their gratitude with humility. He had done what needed to be done, not for recognition, but because it was right. News of the victory spread quickly across the galaxy. The Galactic Council, which had once dismissed the Zekthar as not worth saving, was now forced to take notice. They could no longer ignore the courage and resilience displayed by humanity and their newfound allies. The Council, reluctant though they were, had no choice but to acknowledge humanity's bravery and strategic prowess. The Zekthar were no longer seen as a species to be pitied. Instead, they were recognized as survivors capable of defending themselves with the help of humanity. For the humans, the battle had proven something important, that they were more than just another race in the galaxy. While others may have had greater technology or physical superiority, it was humanity's empathy, their willingness to stand up for the defenseless, that set them apart. They had faced impossible odds and come out victorious, not because they were the strongest, but because they refused to give up on those who needed help. Captain Harper, standing on the now recovering Zekthar homeworld, looked out over the horizon. The planet, once on the verge of complete destruction, was starting to heal. Harper knew the price that had been paid, the lives that had been lost in the fight for freedom. But he also knew that those sacrifices had not been in vain. The Zekthar would live on, and they would remember this day not as a day of destruction, but as the day they found their strength. As Harper reflected on the events, he couldn't help but think of humanity's place in the galaxy. They were not the most advanced, nor the most powerful, but they had something that no other species could match, an indomitable will to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. It wasn't just about survival. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. Harper knew that as long as humanity held on to that core belief, they would continue to thrive, even in a galaxy that often seemed indifferent to justice. The Zekthar would move forward, stronger and more united than ever before. And humanity, having stood by their side, would be remembered not just as allies, but as friends. This victory, hard-fought and dearly won, was a testament to what could be achieved when empathy and determination came together. The galaxy had learned something that day. Humanity would always be there, ready to fight for those who needed them most. And in the end, that made them more powerful than any weapon or fleet.